This is Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Inspiring and providing real insight to our listeners with every story. Exploring deep stories behind every guest. Please welcome your host, Bo Tiffany.
Welcome to another episode of Digital Voices. This is part 2 of Epstein's Islands. We're going to explore the modernization of the USVI, basically from the time that it was purchased in the early 1900s going forward. And this will hopefully open your eyes to the evolution of the situation that we're currently facing in the USVI. In 1917, the U.S. Virgin Islands was sold to the United States by Denmark for $25 million. The U.S. Virgin Islands became a U.S. territory and its citizens became U.S. citizens. During this time, the U.S. Virgin Islands economy shifted from agriculture to tourism, and the sugar plantations that had been the cornerstone of the economy for centuries began to decline. In 1927, the first hotel was built on St. Thomas, marking the beginning of the island's tourism industry. During World War II, the U.S. Virgin Islands was an important strategic location for the U.S. military, with the U.S. building 2 naval bases on the island. After the war, the bases were closed and the U.S. Virgin Islands faced significant economic challenges. In 1954, the U.S. Congress passed the Organic Act that established a government for the U.S. Virgin Islands and gave the islands more autonomy. The first locally elected governor was elected in 1970. In the 1960s, the U.S. Virgin Islands became a center of civil rights movement. The islands faced significant discrimination, and civil rights activists fought to end segregation and racial inequality. In 1969, the U.S. Virgin Islands was granted a non-voting seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. The 1970s were marked by significant political and economic changes in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The territory began to move towards greater self-determination, and there was a growing movement for independence. In 1978, the U.S. Virgin Islands adopted a new constitution, which gave the territory more autonomy and established a unicameral legislature. In the 1980s, the USVI experienced an economic boom driven by tourism, offshore banking, and oil refining. During this time, the U.S. Virgin Islands also faced significant social and environmental challenges. The islands experienced a significant increase in crime and drug trafficking. In 1991, Hurricane Hugo devastated the USVI, causing billions of dollars in damage and displacing thousands of residents. The storm served as a wake-up call for the need to invest in infrastructure and emergency preparedness. Throughout the 1990s, the USVI experienced a boom in tourism. Despite this fact, fueled in part by the development of new hotels, restaurants, and shopping centers. This led to an expansion of service sector and a decline in the importance of agriculture and other traditional industries. In 1995, the U.S. Congress passed the Organic Act, which gave the USVI greater autonomy in its internal affairs and established a unicameral legislature. This is a significant milestone in the USVI's quest for greater self-determination. However, the USVI has also faced significant challenges. The territory continues to struggle with high levels of poverty and unemployment, as well as issues related to crime, education, and healthcare. The government also faced accusations of corruption and mismanagement. In 1999, the USVI suffered another major hurricane, Hurricane Lenny, which caused widespread damage and disrupted the economy. In the early 2000s, the USVI faced a crisis within its healthcare system, as the territory's sole hospital struggled with financial difficulties and allegations of mismanagement. The government eventually privatized the hospital, but the issue underscored the challenges facing the USVI's healthcare infrastructure. The USVI also faced a significant budget deficit in the late 2000s, prompting the government to institute austerity measures and seek assistance from the U.S. federal government. This underscored the U.S. Virgin Islands' dependence on external sources of funding and its vulnerability to economic shocks. In recent years, the USVI has continued to struggle with issues related to crime, poverty, and economic development. However, there have also been positive developments such as growth of renewable energy and sustainable tourism, which have the potential to create new opportunities and reduce the U.S. Virgin Islands' dependence on fossil fuels. In 2017, the USVI suffered another devastating hurricane, Hurricane Irma, which caused widespread damage and led to a prolonged power outage. The storm highlighted the need for greater investment in infrastructure and emergency preparedness, as well as the importance of addressing the impacts of climate change. And actually, in 2017, they were hit by 2 hurricanes. Overall, the U.S. Virgin Islands has experienced significant changes in recent decades, both positive and negative. The territory has made some progress in some areas, such as gaining greater autonomy and expanding its service sector. However, it also faces significant challenges related to poverty, healthcare, and economic development. And the impacts of climate change are likely to exacerbate these issues in the coming years. So let's talk about some of the crime statistics, if you will. The U.S. Virgin Islands is a territory of the United States, but it's an unincorporated territory. Its unique location and status have made it difficult to control crime and ensure justice for victims. Over the past few decades, the USVI has seen a rise in crime, with many perpetrators operating with an air of impunity. This has created a significant challenge for law enforcement and the judicial system, resulting in difficulties for victims to find justice. One of the major reasons for the rise in crime in the U.S. Virgin Islands is the economic downturn that occurred in the territory in the late 20th century. This resulted in a high unemployment rate and increased poverty, which in turn contributed to an increase in crime. Additionally, the U.S. Virgin Islands is a transit point for drug traffickers and located near major drug trafficking routes, leading to an increase in drug-related crimes in the area. The air of impunity for wrongdoers is also a significant factor contributing to the rise of crime in the U.S. Virgin Islands. There have been reports of corrupt officials and law enforcement officers leading to a lack of trust in the system and an unwillingness to report crimes. This has resulted in a situation where perpetrators can operate without fear of being caught and punished. Furthermore, the judicial system in the USVI has been overwhelmed by the sheer number of cases, leading to lengthy delays in the processing of cases. These difficulties in finding justice have had significant impact on victims in the USVI. Many victims feel helpless and frustrated as they are unable to receive justice for crimes committed against them. The lack of trust in the system also has led to a situation where victims may not even report crimes, further perpetuating the problem of impunity. To address this issue, there needs to be a concerted effort to reform the judicial system and increase the resources allocated to law enforcement. This could include measures such as increasing the number of judges and court personnel to process cases more quickly, as well as increasing funding for law enforcement agencies to improve their capabilities. Additionally, there should be an effort to address root causes in crime, such as poverty, unemployment. This prevents people from turning to crime in the first place. The rise of crime and the air of impunity in the U.S. Virgin Islands is a complex issue, requires a multifaceted solution. by increasing resources for law enforcement and judicial system, as well as addressing the root causes of crime. So we know the case of Jeffrey Epstein and his alleged abuse of young girls has brought the spotlight on the Virgin Islands, where much of the abuse is said to have taken place. It has also raised questions about how Epstein's may have used the legal corruption and culture of impunity in the U.S. Virgin Islands to his advantage. The U.S. Virgin Islands has a long history of corruption and scandals involving public officials, lawyers, and judges. This culture of impunity has allowed many wrongdoers to operate without fear of punishment, leading to a rise in crime and making it difficult for victims to find justice. In Epstein's case, it's alleged that he was able to use his wealth and connections to manipulate the legal system in his favor. He reportedly had a close relationship with the former governor of the U.S. Virgin Islands, John D. Jong, who appointed him to the board of a government agency. It's also alleged that Epstein made substantial donations to the University of the Virgin Islands, where he was given an office and access to young girls. Epstein was able to avoid serious legal consequences for many years, despite numerous allegations of sexual abuse and trafficking of minors. It's alleged that he also used his wealth and connections to bribe officials and silence his victims. It also is alleged that he used his private island, Little St. James, as a base of operations for his illegal activities. The USVI legal system reputation for corruption and the culture of impunity may have played a role in allowing Epstein to operate without consequences. The U.S. Virgin Islands has a backlog of over 175 disciplinary cases involving lawyers, and civil cases have been known to drag on for decades. The USVI's limited resources, combined with the backlog of cases, may have made it difficult for law enforcement to properly investigate allegations against Epstein. The Epstein case has brought renewed attention to the need for transparency and accountability in the USVI system, in particular the legal system. Many advocates are calling for reforms that would strengthen legal protections for victims of sexual abuse and trafficking, as well as greater accountability for public officials, lawyers, and judges. The case has also highlighted the need for greater resources to be allocated to law enforcement and the judiciary to ensure that they can effectively investigate and prosecute cases of abuse and corruption. The USVI has been plagued with a backlog of cases that have been left unresolved for years, with victims struggling to find justice. This is due to a lack of resources, corruption, and obstruction of justice. This raises the question of whether the U.S. Virgin Islands can effectively manage its own court system, or if cases should be tried in the U.S. mainland to avoid conflicts of interest and ensure that justice is served. One of the primary issues that the USVI court system has is the backlog of cases. Civil cases have stretched back to 2000, while criminal cases take an average of 12 years to get to trial. In addition, there's a culture of impunity in the USVI that allows for powerful individuals to operate without consequence, which has further contributed to the backlog of cases. Another issue is corruption, which has been a persistent problem in the USVI for years. The FBI has investigated cases involving government officials and individuals with financial and other interests in avoiding liability for wrongdoing in the U.S. Virgin Islands. This corruption has contributed to the obstruction of justice, as those with power and influence are able to manipulate the system to their advantage. In the case of Jeffrey Epstein, who had significant ties to the USVI, it is possible that his wealth and influence allowed him to evade justice and continue to engage in criminal behavior. Given these issues, it is difficult to argue that the USVI can effectively manage its own court system. The backlog of cases, the lack of resources, and culture of impunity and corruption make it nearly impossible for victims to find justice. Therefore, it may be necessary to try cases in the U.S. mainland, where there is a greater level of resources and a more impartial judicial system. This would help to avoid conflicts of interest, as powerful individuals in the U.S. Virgin Islands would be unable to manipulate the system to their advantage. While trying cases in the U.S. mainland may be a viable solution, it's obviously not without its own challenges. The logistics of moving cases to the mainland would need to be carefully considered, and obviously would be the potential impact on the victims and witnesses who might not be able to travel to the mainland. But we're living in an era of video conferencing where, especially post-COVID, everything is in place, logistical means to try these cases on the mainland of the United States. In addition, there may be concerns about cultural differences and the ability of mainland judges to fully understand the unique challenges facing the U.S. Virgin Islands. The USVI court has been plagued with a backlog of cases, corruption and obstruction of justice, making it difficult for victims to find justice. While trying cases in the U.S. mainland may be a viable solution, ultimately the goal should be to enforce that justice is served and victims are protected. We need to ensure the goal, whether it's through the USVI system or through alternative means. Legal corruption within the Office of Disciplinary Counsel in the U.S. Virgin Islands has been an issue for decades. The ODC is responsible for investigating complaints against attorneys and recommending disciplinary action to the Territorial Supreme Court. However, the agency has faced criticism for being ineffective and corrupt, allowing attorneys who engage in unethical behavior to avoid punishment. One notable example of legal corruption in the USVI is the bribery of the ODC and the Professional Regulation Commission, PRC. In 2005, former USVI Senator Elvin Williams was sentenced to 4 years in prison for accepting bribes from attorneys who were facing disciplinary action by the PRC and the ODC. Williams would reportedly accept cash and other gifts from attorneys in exchange for delaying or stopping investigations into their misconduct. This kind of corruption is particularly harmful because it allows attorneys to avoid accountability for their actions, leaving victims without recourse. When attorneys are allowed to act unethically without consequence, it undermines the integrity of the entire legal system. The problem of legal corruption in the ODC extends beyond bribery, however. There have been numerous complaints about the agency dating back to the 1990s, with allegations of the agency being ineffective and slow to act on complaints against attorneys. For example, in 1996, the Virgin Island Bar Association released a report criticizing the ODC for taking too long to process complaints and recommending that the agency be reorganized to improve its efficiency. Yet, despite these recommendations, the agency has continued to face criticism for being slow and ineffective. The backlog of cases within the ODC is one of the major factors contributing to its dysfunction. As of now, there is a backlog of 175 cases and only one part-time investigator for the ODC. Again, the Office of Disciplinary Counsel. Civil cases have stretched back to 2000, and criminal cases take an average of 12 years to get to trial. This kind of backlog not only brings frustration to the victims, but it makes it difficult for the victims to seek justice. It is also allowing attorneys who engage in unethical behavior to continue practicing without consequence. In addition, the lack of resources within the ODC means that the agency is often unable to conduct thorough investigations into complaints against attorneys. This lack of investigative power can lead to attorneys avoiding punishment for their actions. The legal corruption in the ODC has created a culture of impunity within the USVI legal system, allowing attorneys to act unethically without fear of consequences. This has had a profound effect on the ability of victims to seek justice, contributing to a broader culture of corruption and abuse within the U.S. Virgin Islands. To address this issue, it may be necessary to remove cases from the USVI and try them in the U.S. mainland to avoid conflicts of interest and obstruction of justice. By moving cases to a more impartial setting, it may be possible to hold attorneys accountable for their actions and provide victims with the justice they deserve. The problem of legal corruption in the USVI and within the ODC is a very serious issue that undermines the integrity of the legal system of the USVI and leaves victims without recourse. While there have been efforts to address this problem in the past, it remains a persistent issue that requires further attention and action. To ensure that justice is served and victims are protected, it may be necessary to take more drastic measures, such as moving cases to the U.S. mainland to address the systematic issues that contribute to legal corruption in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The U.S. Virgin Islands have been embroiled in corruption and scandal that span decades, with most recent iteration involving the late financier and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Despite Epstein's death, the corruption in the USVI persists. The USVI has a long history of corruption dating back to the colonial period. However, in recent years, corruption has become more entrenched, particularly within the Office of Disciplinary Counsel and the PRC. The ODC is responsible for investigating and disciplining attorneys who violate ethical rules, while the PRC is responsible for voting on what measures or disciplinary actions are taken. The corruption within these agencies is primarily rooted in bribery. Attorneys and police officers who engage in unethical or illegal behavior are often shielded from prosecution by their colleagues who are members of the USVI bar, volunteers on the ODC's PRC board. In exchange for this protection, the corrupt members receive bribes, making it extremely difficult for victims to obtain justice. Epstein's case is a prime example of how corruption in the USVI has enabled powerful individuals to evade justice. Despite numerous accusations of sexual abuse and trafficking of minors, Epstein managed to avoid significant consequences for years, due in part to his connections and influence within the USVI. He was able to leverage his power and wealth to evade accountability, and his death has done little to change this reality. One of the reasons why corruption persists in the U.S. Virgin Islands is the lack of resources and funding to investigate and prosecute these cases. The USVI is a small, economically challenged territory with limited resources, making it difficult to conduct comprehensive investigations and bringing corrupt individuals to justice. However, I will note that they have 15 representatives, each making, I believe it's $125,000 or $200,000 a year, somewhere in that neighborhood. 15 representatives to represent basically 100,000 people, less than 100,000 residents. Furthermore, this lack of oversight and accountability within the U.S. Virgin Islands government allows corrupt individuals to act with impunity. The federal government has limited power to intervene in the affairs of the U.S. territory, leaving the USVI government to largely police itself. The ongoing corruption in the U.S. Virgin Islands has significant implications for victims seeking justice. It can lead to lengthy delays in cases, victims being re-traumatized, and the inability to hold perpetrators accountable. This creates a sense of helplessness and disillusionment amongst victims and ultimately discourage individuals from seeking justice in the USVI period. The USVI corruption that enabled Epstein to evade justice is still rampant. This is due to the lack of resources, the culture of impunity, the lack of oversight and accountability within the U.S. Virgin Islands government. The result is a system that is broken, a lack of justice for victims. Until there are significant reforms made, this corruption is likely to persist and the justice for USVI victims will remain elusive. It's my goal to shed awareness. I've been a victim myself of the USVI, going back to 2016, still victimizing, still falling into a lot of what we're talking about. But everything is confidential. You can't even say that you filed a attorney grievance. That's considered confidential. But the information that I am sharing is public.
This has been Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany, exploring deep stories from real-life guests with real-life experiences, providing insight to our listeners with every story. Stay up to date on future podcasts by bookmarking Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany.podbean.com and follow Bo on social media by searching Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Have an idea for a future story? Send your idea to acrmadison@gmail.com. Until next time, grab life by the horns and keep inspiring others.